Hey, what's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Mastering Metabolism by Pinoe Analytics. I hope you are doing very well. This is another live Saturday session. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about overtraining as it relates to hormones. Now, nothing I'm about to say is the whole picture. Okay, this is a huge topic which would probably require hours worth to cover, but I'm really interested in helping you to connect the dots with why overtraining happens because of how our hormonal system is developed or designed. And I'm going to talk from an evolutionary perspective for biology, because that really helps to give you a good eye view of how these things evolved and whatnot. But let's make sure that you understand what I'm talking about with regard to overtraining, what the heck that actually is, before we move on to what hormones have to do with it. So, first of all, if you're not familiar with this graph, then you need to get familiar with it to understand overtraining well. It's general adaptation syndrome. That's GAS, general adaptation syndrome. And general adaptation syndrome describes how a biological system adapts to stressors, how it could potentially adapt to stressors. And general adaptation syndrome applies not just in exercise. It can also apply with how we adapt to our jobs. Let's say you get a new job. General adaptation syndrome is going to describe how you adapt to that as well. And so it's important that you understand that this is a large-scale rule, a large-scale syndrome for how we adapt to new stressors. Now, in general adaptation syndrome, you start at a certain level with regard to the skill or the trait or the proficiency that we're talking about. And what happens is you apply a stressor. So over a period of 1 to 6 weeks even, you apply a stressor. And what happens is whatever performance or proclivity you have for that particular skill or that adaptation, you actually decrease in relative performance. So performance is on this scale, time is on this scale, and over a period of 1 to 6 weeks, when you add a new stressor, then the actual performance for that thing dips. And this is what we call stage 1 of general adaptation syndrome. General adaptation syndrome stage 1 is called the alarm phase. In the alarm phase of general adaptation syndrome, a lot of things are happening in the body at a biological level. Basically, you're under a lot of stress. Okay, not just stress, the hormone, but neurotransmitter-wise, you're under a lot of stress, and you're starting to tax the body's resources. And this level of stress requires a large level of recovery as performance begins to dip, right? So if this is muscle size, when you first start a hypertrophy regimen, the cross-sectional area of muscle tissue actually decreases at first in response to the stress of hypertrophy training. The same is said of cardiovascular fitness. If you start building a foundation or base and you start, let's say, going for long runs when you haven't run before, your performance will actually decrease at first in the alarm phase. So let's say you do the Cooper test, which is if you don't have a Pinoe metabolic unit, you can't measure VO2 directly, and so you do a Cooper test. And a Cooper test is how far can you travel in 12 minutes? And you can run, you can walk, you can stop in there, whatever, but that's a quick field test to actually rate a VO2 on, right? If you do a Cooper test on a client at the very beginning of their cardiovascular regimen, and then you start them exercising, 2 or 3 weeks later, they're actually going to decrease their Cooper test, their Cooper test results. What happened? Our exercise resulted in a less than helpful adaptation. Well, no, you didn't do anything wrong. That's just the alarm phase. What's up, Panos? Good to see you joining us live. What's up, Leo and Marco? Good to have you guys. We're talking about overtraining in relationship to our hormones. And so first we got to walk through our general adaptation syndrome in order to understand what the heck overtraining actually is. So in stage 1 of general adaptation syndrome, we're in the alarm phase. The body goes, whoa, this is a stressful thing. And it starts tapping into our stored resources in order to create biological adaptations. So if everything goes well, if you're periodizing a program correctly from a strength training perspective or cardiovascular perspective, then we start an upswing. This can be anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks into the program where we enter phase 2. And phase 2 is what's called the resistance phase. The resistance phase. When I first started learning about this, I remember thinking, like, is this the phase that you lift weights? Like, that's what resistance meant to me. Resistance literally means the biological mechanism that the body basically says, hell no, we won't go. It has responded to the stress. And instead of performance continuing to decline as you tap into your body's resources, you actually begin to recover in a way that allows you to perform at a higher level. Cardiovascularly speaking, your times will get faster. You'll be able to run farther. You'll feel a little less rate of perceived exertion during your workouts, for instance. From a musculoskeletal perspective, if we're talking about lifting weights here, this is where we'll actually see the cross-sectional area of the muscle begin to increase. The weights start to go up, and you see less delayed onset muscle soreness, right? So this is the resistance phase. This is the phase where you start to feel like I've got a handle on this thing, right? And then if all continues to go well, our program continues to progress. Let's say from a cardiovascular perspective, we're increasing our volume week over week, or we might be increasing our intensity week over week. Then what happens is we enter the phase called supercompensation. That's phase 3 of general adaptation syndrome, supercompensation. What's supercompensation? Basically, it's for anybody who might be an anime fan out there, it's the idea of being a Saiyan, where you get hurt, you end up in a rough spot, and then when you recover, you come back stronger than you started, right? And this actually happens biologically. That's a deep biological truth. When a biological system has to adapt to a stressor, and the stressor doesn't destroy the biological system, then the biological system bounces back stronger, either stronger physically, you have more muscle tissue than you had before, or stronger cardiovascularly, you have a higher VO2, better respiratory exchange ratio, increased mitochondrial density, that sort of thing. The point is, whether it's performance from a cardiovascular perspective, from a resistance training perspective, and then, if you're doing your job and you're entering general adaptation syndrome, you get worse at your job, then you get better at your job, and then you're way better than when you started. And that process can take 12, even 16 weeks, right? That is the final phase of general adaptation syndrome. And when we're training clients, that's the goal. We want them to enter the alarm phase, get enough rest and recovery and nutrients that they enter the resistance phase, and then they can achieve supercompensation through progressive program design. Now, what happens to some people is that they enter the alarm phase, they start the resistance phase, but instead of continuing the resistance phase, they enter what's called the overtraining phase. And overtraining is biologically where the system has experienced too much stress and not enough recovery. Too much stress and not enough recovery in order to reach resistance and supercompensation. We'll talk more about that from a hormonal perspective in just a second, but you really need to wrap your head around this, because there are so many factors that play into whether or not a client is going to enter this phase of training. In different ways you can actually measure that, right? So if you're using a Pinoe analyzer, one of the things that you can do is you can get some baseline metrics on this person at the very beginning of their program. You can get VO2, you can get respiratory exchange ratio, you can get power output, that's metabolic efficiency, that's power output versus fuel consumption, right? And all of those measures can give you an understanding of where this person's starting. Now, 4 to 6 weeks into their program, sure, they're going to be in the bottom of that alarm phase. Well, maybe I say 4 to 6 weeks. That's not true for everybody. It could be 2 weeks into the program before they, start the curve up, the resistance piece. It could be 6 weeks into their program before they do it. But this is important. If you're 4 weeks into the program, let's say we've got a VO2 measure and an RER measure on them. If you're 4 weeks into the program and they're still in this valley of performance, their VO2 goes down, Their respiratory exchange ratio shows a higher carbohydrate burn at the same workloads that they started training. Their metabolic efficiency goes down even while you're training to be more efficient. Then those are some clues to you that your periodization is not allowing for the proper balance of stress and recovery. Perhaps you have too much volume. Perhaps you have too much intensity. Perhaps you're not recovering well enough. There's not enough time in between, or there's not enough base training to high intensity training ratio in that program design. And so that's a sign that you need to make a shift in your program as a coach. And what's interesting about this is you'll know this measuring this with a Pinoy device. You'll know this way before your client will, right? For many people who can't measure this kind of stuff, what happens is we don't find out that our client's overtraining until here. And it's usually like a red flag in their mind. They're like, hey, I've stopped losing weight. I've plateaued in my weight loss. I've plateaued in my fat loss. Hey, my runs are feeling a little weird. I'm feeling really demotivated. And when we start to dive into it, we realize their performance metrics have dropped significantly. They're not recovering enough. Something's happened in their life that might be, ruining their sleep. It might not be you at all as a coach, by the way. Perhaps you created the perfect program for them, and then the holidays put a significant damper on their ability to recover well from their workouts. Whatever the case is, if you're able to measure these metrics and you're at the 4 to 6 week mark and you haven't made that upswing into resistance and supercompensation, that's an indication to you that you've moved into the overtraining phase. So very important piece. Now, let's then talk about, since we understand what overtraining is in relationship to general adaptation syndrome, let's talk about why that happens, okay? Now, this happens for a number of reasons, but one of them is at the level of the hormones. And if you've spent any time hanging out with me, you know that you can talk to me for about 5 to 10 minutes about fitness before I'm going to bring up the hormonal system. Insulin, testosterone, thyroid, cortisol, all of those things are the biological basis for how we adapt to exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle, right? And so our hormones are the biological, biomolecular messengers of our neurological system. So when I say I'm stressed on a hormonal level, that means I have elevated cortisol. When I say I'm having trouble gaining muscle, I'm recovering poorly, on a hormonal level, that means my testosterone and estradiol balance is out of whack. When I say I don't have very much energy, my hair looks like garbage, I've got dark circles under my eyes, I'm carrying back fat, that's a thyroid hormone thing, right? There's a lot of different things that we could relate our fitness journeys to the hormonal system. But overtraining is a very special one because it relates to every single one of our clients. And I want you to understand that on a hormonal level. So we call this the master hormone, pregnenolone. Your body synthesizes this out of generally fat and cholesterol with the help of some enzymes, synthesizes the master hormone called pregnenolone. Now, pregnenolone can be used by your body to make several things, but there are 2 distinct pathways I want to focus on today. And mind you, this is pretty simplified. So if you want to know deeper, let me know. But the 2 pathways that are especially interesting in the use of pregnenolone in our body are these 2 pathways. So the body synthesizes pregnenolone, which is the master hormone, and then pregnenolone can go this way or that way. And this is important because this way leads to progesterone. You might have heard about that before in relationship to like female hormonal cycles. Later, it could also lead to aldosterone. Aldosterone is a hormone that's very important in relationship to managing our hydration. It acts on our kidneys, tells our body whether or not we should be increasing the amount of water we're carrying or decreasing the amount of water we're carrying. But here's the big one. Progesterone can also change into cortisol. Cortisol has been given a bad rap. It's our stress hormone, right? But cortisol is also the hormone that wakes us up in the morning. You're a diurnal mammal, which means that your cortisol should be high in the morning because that's when you should be most active. That wakes you up from your sleep, and your circadian rhythm is such that cortisol should decrease over the day so that by nighttime you're ready to go to bed. Cortisol bottoms out, you get to recover, you get to sleep, and then wake up and do it all over again. Cortisol is not a bad hormone by any means, but when we are very stressed, cortisol can elevate to meet the demand of energy placed on our body. And that's where cortisol gets a bad rap, because a lot of people are very stressed. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The second pathway that pregnenolone can go toward is the sex hormone pathway. So here we have a hormone we like to call DHEA because it's really hard to say. DHEA can then be converted into, it can be converted to several different things. Just 1 second. Testosterone. Good thing this isn't a spelling class. And then estradiol, which is a form of one of the estrogens. And now arrows can go all over here. Estradiol can actually be used to create some progesterone, and there's a little interplay between the two, how they function and focus. Female hormone systems are a lot of fun, by the way. But what I want you to notice is that the body has a choice in how it uses pregnenolone. Fundamentally, we have a certain amount of pregnenolone. I could use that pregnenolone to create aldosterone, which helps to regulate water, right? I could use pregnenolone to create cortisol. I could use pregnenolone to bolster DHEA, and then down the line, testosterone and estradiol. Pregnenolone can go in two very important directions, right? The question is, from a biological perspective, which of these two pathways is more important? Which of these two pathways do you think gets priority in the immediate? I'll tell you, pregnenolone often in our clients is used to create cortisol. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Remember, cortisol isn't all bad, right? Cortisol is responsible for our circadian rhythm on a daily basis as a diurnal mammal. However, remember, in general adaptation syndrome, when we start a new workout program, we are elevating the amount of stress for this biological system, and therefore our client's body is going to respond with some cortisol output. Is that bad? No, it's just part of general adaptation syndrome. What's bad is if they don't get to recover enough before they run out of DHEA. Okay, so imagine that my client starts a new program. They're 2 weeks into the program, their body's kind of stressed out, they're in the alarm phase of general adaptation syndrome. It's really not a big deal right now. It's not a big deal because they have a certain amount of DHEA. You can store that in the body. That's a good thing. You have a certain amount of DHEA. The body's stealing pregnenolone to make cortisol, but you have a certain amount of DHEA just hanging out, being used to create your testosterone and estradiol. Everything's good. Things are stressful, but I have the resilience. Sometimes this is called the resiliency hormone. I have the resilience to respond to the stress. It's okay if pregnenolone is being used to make cortisol in response to the stressor of the program. If my client's getting enough sleep, then what happens is the program becomes less stressful. If my client's getting enough rest, if they're getting enough nutrients in their system, things are starting to restore, the biological system's adapting, everything's good. What happens is you stop using pregnenolone to create cortisol, you enter the resistance phase, and then supercompensation, and pregnenolone can be used to restore the DHEA that you lost in the alarm phase. Where this becomes a problem is when my client isn't recovering well. They're not eating well. They're not sleeping well. They're not getting enough recovery days in relationship to their high intensity days. And what happens is eventually you run out of DHEA. Think of it like DHEA is the wax of a candle. And if you burn the candle at both ends, you're not recovering and you're exercising very hard. You burn the candle at both ends. Eventually, you have no more candle wax. That's a problem because then you're not creating enough testosterone and then you're not creating enough estradiol. And a lot of things happen in the body as a result, biochemically speaking, right? Simultaneously, if you're overproducing cortisol in response to the stress of the workout program, cortisol is one of the most catabolic hormones in the body. Catabolic means you break down tissues into smaller constituent parts, in cortisol's case, to be used as energy, right? You break down, you've heard of gluconeogenesis. That's the process by which cortisol is one of the hormones that acts on that, can break down muscle tissue in order to create glucose, right? Your body's so stressed out, it needs a short-term fuel source. Where's it going to get it? Well, I'm going to eat your muscle tissue to create that sugar that you need in that stressful situation. Now, again, this is a natural process. If you're getting enough rest and recovery, if your nutrition's on point, right, and your program is balanced so that you have enough intensity along with enough recovery, then eventually you stop the stealing pregnenolone and DHEA doesn't have to run out on you. But you enter the overtraining phase from a hormonal perspective when you stress the body too long without enough recovery to allow the candle wax to build back up. And what happens is, instead of entering the resistance phase and then the supercompensation phase, VO2 goes up, respiratory exchange ratio shifts toward a more stubborn fat burn, metabolic efficiency changes in the way that you wanted to see. Instead of those things happening, you enter the overtraining phase where cortisol rules. You're requiring your adrenal glands basically to foot the bill for acute stress rather than long-term adaptation, and your client's program will fail. It's just a question of when. And so oftentimes, this is pretty complex stuff. Oftentimes what I tell clients is, look, I want to measure you in the very beginning of our program so I understand what our baseline metrics are. Then we're going to do the program that's personalized to you. I'll create that level of volume and that level of intensity, and we'll do that program. 4 weeks from now, we're going to retest. We should see slight improvements, and we should also see you reporting recovering well, not too much delayed onset muscle soreness, no intense cravings, that sort of thing, in order to know we're doing a great job. We're going to keep progressively increasing our volume and intensity. If we come back to test at 4 weeks and your metabolic efficiency, your VO2, your RER are changing in bad ways, and we're burning lots of carbs as a fuel source at these workloads, then that tells me that we're overtraining. That tells me that we need to shift your workout to a little less volume, a little less intensity, and be more purposeful about more regular recovery. So maybe we only have a recovery day every 5 days right now. We might need a recovery every 3 days if those numbers come back. So in that way, you can use your measures and your understanding as a coach in order to make sure that your client doesn't overproduce cortisol and burn the candle at both ends and nuke their DHEA. And from a hormonal perspective, that's what overtraining is. That's how overtraining happens, and that's how we can work a little harder to prevent that with intelligent measuring tools. So this has been Alex Van Houten with Mastering Metabolism. If you have questions, comments, or concerns about this, bring it. Thank you to you guys who joined us live. I hope that this was informative and good for you. I'm really looking forward to what we're bringing in 2019. Stay tuned. Some really cool stuff coming down the pipes. Until next time, guys, kick butt, take names.